analyst Frank Figliuzzi. Frank, thank you for being here. Let's just go through some of what we just heard from our reporter. So you have this alleged shooter who posts this screed online on one of these, not Twitter or Facebook, one of these sort of secondary online sites, and then commits this crime, talks about in this screed what kind of gun they were going to use, and makes it very clear. First line references the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand. Second line references an Hispanic invasion, and claims that they're doing this to stop said invasion by Hispanics of Texas and therefore the U.S. What does that tell you we should be thinking about when it comes to attacks like this?
Well, this raises a couple of things. First, there's a kind of peer group radicalization that's occurring. They're inspiring each other and egging each other on, and there's very, very eerie similarities to the gaming community, where gamers will talk about their scores. How did you do? Get a good score. We even see that on the site involving the El Paso shooter. As he says he's on his way to an attack, someone says, get a good score. This is the kind of thing that we're dealing with today. The other thing that's really an important discussion to have is this notion that, in about 25 minutes prior to the shooting, some law enforcement entity, I'm told possibly the Fusion Center, not the FBI, but rather an intelligence fusion center, was contacted regarding this information. And why is that important? Because that means that law enforcement was not already in that site or monitoring that site. And so if you want to draw comparisons between the international terrorism world and the statutes and policies and protocols that govern that, and compare it to the domestic terrorism world, we have a gap, and that gap needs to be addressed. What do I mean by that? The FBI and the intelligence community are all over ISIS, Al-Qaeda sites, right? And they're advocating violence, and we've got international terrorism laws that govern arresting people specifically for terrorism on the international scale. And guess what? We don't have it on the domestic terrorism site. So any notions, I've heard some misinformation being put out that, oh, the FBI was in the site, oh, law enforcement's inside the site monitoring this. No, they're not. Why? Because they're not allowed to. And what's the issue? Free speech. And free speech is critical to our society. But hate speech that in a second turns to violence, somehow we've got to figure out how to, within the constraints of our society, address that issue, because right now we're blind to it unless someone raises their hand and says this person's going to hurt someone.
Well, that's very important that you mentioned that. I want to drill down into that just a little bit further, because there is a lot of tension just in the conversation when these shootings happen about why they are not called terrorism immediately. And there are issues of these not being foreign, attackers, not being Muslim, to be blunt, and being American. And so in a country where we do have a First Amendment, are you saying that the FBI, that federal law enforcement cannot monitor it when, in the case of this screed that was posted by this person, they say very clearly that they are going to buy weapons. They say very clearly that they are going to kill people and then attempt to justify why they're going to do it. So how does that not then allow federal law enforcement to take action either there or with the social media companies, because essentially they're allowing people to post very blatant, open threats of murder?
Well, law enforcement can certainly take action if there's specificity to time, place, and they can knock on doors and talk to people who are theorizing about committing acts of violence. The problem, Joy, is getting that information in the first place. If you're not there to hear it, if you're not inside the site to see it, you rely on decent people, some of which were in this site, by the way, who said, hello, FBI, when they saw this person talking about this. And someone, I think it will turn out, contacted law enforcement. But unless we're in there to see it, we can't act on it in a timely fashion. And even in this case, with about 25 minutes is what I'm hearing prior to the attack, some kind of vague, generic notion that someone, somewhere, anonymously is going to do something. Very difficult to deal with that in time. So we've got to address that as a nation. There's no easy fix to this. I'm a strong advocate of free speech, but when you have a bunch of guys, let's say you have a bunch of guys in a militia group, they hang out on weekends, they drink beers, and they talk about how they hate brown people. Well, in a split second, somebody in that group could say, well, I hate brown people, and I'm going to kill one next weekend. at that flashpoint moment, there needs to be a way for us to understand who that is and what his intentions are, and we can't rely on the other groups in that militia to report it. So this is a growing problem. The hate problem, you know, we talk about a gun problem, we talk about a mental health problem. We've got a hate problem, and part of it is this radicalization comparison. I'm seeing eerie similarities between Islamic extremist violent radicalization and white hate radicalization. And what's the commonality? Well, one of them is there's a mentor. There, you know, on the Islamic side, you have young people online getting radicalized by a father figure cleric who's inspiring them. They aspire to be like him, and this Svengali effect occurs. Well, we've got such a leader. It's the President of the United States who has to come out and intervene. How do you break the radicalization chain? You have that figure come out and say, I reject this. I reject white hate. I reject violence. It's not what I want. It's not what I mean to say. I'm done with it. I don't want you. I don't need you. Unless that president comes out and takes that successful intervention, we're going to see another shooting.
Very important to mention that. You had Chris Wray, the FBI director, come out and say that white nationalist attacks, white nationalist terrorism, domestic terrorism, is now the single largest threat to Americans' safety. So we know that that is true. As you mentioned, you have rhetoric even coming out of the President of the United States that uses some of the same words, invasion, etc. So then why is this not classified as terrorism? Why isn't it simply classified straight ahead as terrorism?
So there's some encouraging news here. We've now heard, and you've reported, that the FBI has now designated this a domestic terrorism investigation. That is very significant, not only from an administrative standpoint, but from a political messaging standpoint. This is domestic terrorism. We even heard the governor of Texas say, this looks like a hate crime. It's going to be investigated as such, in addition to being a murder. This is a positive step. It's horrifying that it took this amount of loss of life for people to call it what it is, but it is domestic terrorism. And if people are saying, well, what's that definition? Well, look, if you're doing something to support a violence, to support a social, religious, or political agenda, you're talking about terrorism. And the fact that it's from white people, regardless of color, it's still terrorism. So we've taken a step. Tragically, it took death to do it, but we've taken a step in the last 24 hours to call this what it is.
And okay, that is an important point. Then when future adherents to this same replacement theory ideology that have the same, that use the same language, that talk about Hispanics and illegal immigration and use that same kind of terminology, then will it follow that future attackers, people who continue to mouth this same ideology, are treated in the same way that the United States, that the federal government has treated foreign attackers who all mouth the same ISIS ideology, right? So they're all classed as terrorism. Then now that we've finally gotten here, will then future people who have the same ideology be classed also as adherents to a terrorist ideology?
Yes, so we're taking that step in the right direction, but that's only half the battle. So labeling and semantics, all very important, but equally, if not more important, is preventing it from happening. So what we don't want to do is sit here next weekend and go, yep, we had another shooting, and thank goodness we now can call it domestic terrorism. I don't want to respond and react to it. I want to prevent it. So to prevent it, we need the same tools in the toolbox that we have for international terrorism, for ISIS, Al-Qaeda. And we don't. Look at a recent statement from the FBI Agents Association, almost unprecedented for that association to come out and actually say, we don't have the tools to address domestic terrorism. I've never heard them say something like that before. Look at the statement this week from the FBI saying to law enforcement partners, conspiracy theories are now a threat in this country. People adhering to those deep state conspiracy theories are actually going to hurt us. Again, unprecedented kind of law enforcement notification. We need to battle domestic terrorism like we do international terrorism, and to do that, we need tools, legislation, and policy changes.
Frank Figliuzzi, can you not go away? Don't go too far away. Okay, can you just stick around for a little while? I'm going to bring you back a little bit.